For nearly 2 decades, Bumpy Johnson survived every kind of enemy New York could throw at him. Italian crews tried to muscle him out of Harlem and failed. Rival hustlers tested him on the street and paid the price. Informants whispered, alliances shifted, and bodies fell, but Bumpy remained standing. Then, quietly and without warning, a far more dangerous opponent entered the picture. Not a rival boss, not the Mafia, the United States government itself. By the late 1952, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood with a shadow economy. It had become a political problem, a symbolic battleground, and a test case for federal authority. And at the center of it all stood Bumpy Johnson, a man the streets understood but Washington did not. To federal agents, he wasn't just a racketeer. He was a power node, someone who could influence money, silence, loyalty, and order without ever holding office or wearing a badge. That made him dangerous in a way bullets never could. So the federal government did what it did best. It didn't send gunmen, it sent microphones. Over 18 months, Bumpy Johnson's world was quietly wrapped in wiretaps and listening devices. Apartments, cars, meeting places, spaces he believed were private became evidence factories. Every word, every pause, every coded sentence was captured, logged, and archived. This was not a street war. It was a long, methodical siege by a system designed to outlast any man. But something went wrong. Despite thousands of hours of surveillance and one of the most extensive monitoring operations ever aimed at a Harlem figure, the case collapsed. No dramatic shootout, no final arrest that made headlines. Just a sudden shutdown. The tapes went silent, the operation ended, and Bumpy Johnson walked away. This story isn't about luck. It's about limits, the limits of federal power when it collides with a man who understands the rules well enough to never quite break them on record. It's the moment when state power confronted street power and discovered that raw authority doesn't always translate into control. This is the story of how the FBI watched Bumpy Johnson for 18 months and how one mistake made the entire operation fall apart. By the end of the 1,950 seconds, Harlem was no longer viewed by Washington as a local law enforcement headache. It had become a federal symbol, a place where crime, race, politics, and public perception collided. And at the center of that collision stood Bumpy Johnson. To the city, he was a known figure. To the streets, he was order. But to the federal government, he represented something far more troubling. A man exercising real power without state permission. This was the era when the Federal Bureau of Investigation was redefining its mission. Under growing political pressure, the Bureau needed visible victories, proof that federal authority could reach places local police could not control. Organized crime was no longer just about illegal money. It was framed as a threat to national stability. Harlem, with its dense population, underground economy, and racial tension, became an ideal proving ground. And Bumpy Johnson was the obvious target. What made Bumpy different from Italian mob bosses wasn't scale, it was position. He wasn't hiding behind suburban mansions or insulated social clubs. He lived among the people he influenced. He mediated disputes, settled debts, and enforced rules in ways that were invisible to formal institutions but deeply understood on the street. That kind of influence couldn't be dismantled with a single arrest. From the FBI's perspective, it had to be mapped, recorded, and dismantled piece by piece. So, instead of raids, the Bureau chose patience. Instead of indictments, it chose observation. This wasn't about catching Bumpy committing a crime in the moment. It was about proving that his entire operation constituted an ongoing criminal enterprise. That required something the FBI believed only it could do: total surveillance. For federal agents, this marked a shift in mindset. Harlem was no longer someone else's jurisdiction. By stepping in, the FBI was effectively declaring that street power had crossed into federal territory. It was a quiet escalation, but a decisive one. Once microphones were authorized and technicians were deployed, the conflict changed shape. No sirens, no headlines, just a slow, deliberate attempt to turn Bumpy's own words into the weapon that would finally end him. But embedded in that decision was a fatal assumption that state power, once applied, was inherently superior. That a man who ruled through silence and reputation would eventually slip when faced with constant observation. What the FBI underestimated was not Bumpy's caution, but his understanding of systems and the fragile legal framework that held federal authority together. Harlem had been entered. The line between local crime and national enforcement had been crossed. And from that moment on, this was no longer a story about gangsters. It was a story about how far the state could go and what happened when it went just a step too far. Once federal authority crossed into Harlem, there was no turning back. This was no longer an investigation designed to gather quick evidence. It was a long-term occupation conducted in silence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation committed to a strategy it believed no street operator could survive: continuous surveillance, not days, not weeks. 18 full months of listening, logging, and waiting for one irreversible mistake. Technicians were brought in quietly, often under the cover of routine maintenance or building inspections. Listening devices were placed in apartments, hallways, and meeting spaces connected to Bumpy Johnson's daily orbit. Cars were wired, telephones were tapped. Any environment where conversation might drift from guarded silence into implication became a potential evidence site. Each microphone fed into a growing archive reel after reel of recorded sound, cataloged by date, time, and subject. This was surveillance as bureaucracy. Agents worked in shifts, headphones on, not searching for drama but for patterns. Who spoke first? Who stayed silent? Which names appeared repeatedly? Which meetings ended abruptly? The goal was not to catch Bumpy Johnson committing a crime on tape. It was to prove command, to show that decisions flowed outward from him even when his own voice barely appeared. In theory, this would allow prosecutors to frame him as the center of a criminal enterprise without ever needing a confession. But the machine ran into an unexpected problem. Bumpy Johnson didn't talk like other bosses. He rarely issued direct instructions. He spoke in fragments, metaphors, and half-statements that meant everything to the people in the room and almost nothing to outsiders. Long recordings produced almost no clean quotes. Hours of tape often ended with agents frustrated, staring at transcripts filled with ambiguity rather than evidence. What made matters worse was the scale of the operation itself. The longer the surveillance continued, the more legally fragile it became. Every extension required renewed authorization. Every microphone placement increased the risk of procedural error. And inside the Bureau, pressure mounted. After so much time, so many resources, and so little usable material, results were expected. That pressure subtly changed behavior. Agents listened harder. Prosecutors pushed for broader interpretations. The line between observation and intrusion began to blur. The machine that was supposed to be flawless grew heavier, more complex, and more exposed to failure. Ironically, the very thing designed to overpower Bumpy Johnson time began working against the FBI. 18 months of surveillance didn't weaken him. It strained the system watching him. And somewhere inside that strain, a single misstep was taking shape. One that would soon render every tape, every transcript, and every hour of listening legally worthless. To the Federal Bureau of Investigation, organized crime followed a familiar logic. Mafia bosses talked, they gave orders, they complained, threatened, negotiated, and eventually slipped. Years of wiretaps against Italian crews had trained agents to expect a certain rhythm, hierarchy expressed through language. Catch the words, and you could prove the power. That assumption worked until it collided with Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy did not operate like a traditional boss. He didn't bark commands or spell out plans. In meetings, He often spoke less than anyone else in the room. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Decisions appeared to happen around him, not because he demanded them, but because everyone already knew where the lines were. On tape, this was a nightmare. Authority without explicit instruction is almost impossible to prosecute. Where Mafia leaders relied on structure, Bumpy relied on understanding. He understood how people spoke when they were being careful. He understood when silence carried more meaning than threats. Most importantly, he understood that the law doesn't punish implication, it punishes statements. So he avoided statements. Conversations drifted into stories, metaphors, jokes, and references to past events that meant nothing without context. To insiders, the message was clear. To federal transcripts, it was noise. This was the moment the FBI realized they weren't listening to a criminal organization, they were listening to a social system. Bumpy's power wasn't lodged in a chain of command. It lived in relationships, reputation, and shared memory. That kind of power leaves almost no legal footprint. You could hear the effect, but never the cause. Italian bosses also had weaknesses Bumpy didn't share. Many enjoyed status. They liked to be seen as decision makers. They wanted their authority recognized, even if only among trusted men. Bumpy didn't need recognition. His authority was already settled. That made him patient, and patience is deadly in a surveillance war. As the months dragged on, agents began to understand the imbalance. The FBI needed one clean moment, one sentence that could anchor a case. Bumpy needed none. He could survive indefinitely inside ambiguity. Every day without a mistake wasn't just survival, it was erosion. The longer the tapes ran without results, the more pressure shifted back onto the Bureau. In trying to prove Bumpy Johnson was powerful, the FBI ran into a paradox. The very reason he was powerful was the same reason they couldn't prove it. And as frustration grew, the investigation began to drift away from precision toward impatience, setting the stage for the single error that would undo everything. After nearly a year and a half of silence, ambiguity, and frustration, the pressure inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation reached a breaking point. Too much time had passed. Too many agents were assigned. Too many resources had been burned to walk away empty-handed. What was supposed to be a patient, airtight operation began to bend under its own weight. And that was when the Bureau made the mistake that Bumpy Johnson had been waiting for without ever having to say so. The problem wasn't technical failure. The microphones worked. The tapes were clear. The logs were meticulous. The failure was legal. In the rush to finally extract something usable, one extension went too far. One authorization crossed a boundary. One listening device remained active beyond the protection of airtight procedure. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless in the way movies portray mistakes. It was subtle, administrative, and devastating. Federal surveillance lives and dies by precision. A single flaw doesn't weaken a case, it poisons it. Once defense attorneys identified the procedural breach, the entire operation collapsed inward. Every recording tied to that error became suspect. And because surveillance cases are cumulative by nature, that contamination spread backward. Months of work were no longer separate pieces of evidence. They were part of a single, compromised chain. For the FBI, this was the nightmare scenario. 18 months of listening had produced no confession, no explicit order, no smoking gun, and now, the one advantage they still had, the sheer volume of material, was legally unusable. The case couldn't be salvaged by trimming the bad parts. It had to be abandoned. What made the moment so bitter was that Bumpy Johnson didn't need to exploit the mistake himself. He didn't challenge the surveillance. He didn't protest. He didn't tip off lawyers or trigger exposure. The system corrected itself. The law stepped in where intimidation and enforcement could not. The operation ended quietly, without public explanation, without vindication, and without resolution. This was the core paradox of state power. The FBI possessed authority Bumpy never could. But that authority came with constraints he never faced. He could operate in shadows, implications, and relationships. The Bureau had to operate on record, inside rules, and under scrutiny. In trying to outlast Bumpy, it forgot that time increases risk for institutions far faster than it does for individuals. When the operation shut down, nothing visibly changed in Harlem. No headlines announced a federal defeat. But inside law enforcement, the message was clear. Raw power was not enough. Surveillance without absolute discipline was a liability, and against a man who understood silence better than speech, one small legal misstep was all it took to turn the watchers into the ones who failed. When the surveillance operation ended, it didn't feel like a defeat, at least not in a way the public could see. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't issue a statement. No court ruling made headlines. No agents were reassigned in disgrace. On the surface, the machinery of the state simply shifted its focus elsewhere. But beneath that silence was an uncomfortable truth. State power had reached its limit. The confrontation between the federal government and Bumpy Johnson was never about who was stronger. It was about how power functions under constraint. The state wields authority, legitimacy, and force, but only within boundaries it is legally required to respect. Street power, by contrast, operates through flexibility. It adapts. It dissolves into relationships. It leaves almost no paper trail. That asymmetry shaped the outcome long before the final mistake was ever made. Bumpy didn't defeat the FBI by outsmarting its technology. He defeated it by existing in a form that technology couldn't fully capture. His authority wasn't located in recorded conversations or explicit commands. It lived in expectation. People did what they believed he wanted, without him needing to say it. For a legal system built on evidence, that kind of power is almost invisible. The FBI learned something crucial in Harlem. Surveillance can hear words, but it cannot easily measure influence. It can record conversations, but it struggles to prosecute systems built on silence. In later decades, this lesson would quietly reshape federal strategy. Investigators would rely more heavily on informants, financial trails, and conspiracy statutes tools designed to bypass the problem Bumpy Johnson represented. Harlem became a case study, not a trophy. For Bumpy, the aftermath was equally revealing. He didn't celebrate. He didn't escalate. He simply continued, knowing that the most dangerous moment in any conflict with the state is the moment it decides to watch instead of act. Once that watching failed, the balance shifted again. This was not a victory of crime over law. It was a demonstration of limits. Limits of surveillance. Limits of authority. Limits of believing that power, when applied long enough, will always produce control. In Harlem, the state discovered that some forms of power cannot be dismantled head-on. They can only be contained, redirected, or waited out. And that realization would echo far beyond Bumpy Johnson. It would shape how America policed cities, monitored dissent, and justified surveillance in the decades that followed. The line between street power and state power didn't disappear. It hardened. And for a brief, revealing moment, one man standing quietly at that line forced the most powerful institution in the country to step back. When the microphones went silent, nothing in Harlem appeared to change. There were no raids, no public arrests, no press conferences announcing a federal victory or defeat. The Federal Bureau of Investigation simply stepped back, leaving behind 18 months of recordings that would never be played in court. On paper, the operation ended without resolution. In reality, it ended with a lesson the Bureau could not ignore. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive the surveillance because he was untouchable. He survived because he understood something fundamental about power in America. The state must obey its own rules, even when its opponents do not. The FBI could watch him indefinitely, but it could not act without perfect legality. One procedural mistake, small enough to seem insignificant at the time, was enough to unravel an entire operation, and once that happened, there was no recovery. This wasn't a story about a gangster outsmarting the government. It was a story about patience versus pressure. Bumpy needed only to endure. The FBI needed to produce results. Time, which was supposed to crush him, instead exposed the fragility of the system watching him. The longer the surveillance lasted, the more risk accumulated not for the man being observed, but for the institution doing the observing. The outcome also reshaped how federal power would be used in the years that followed. Future investigations would lean harder on informants, financial crimes, and conspiracy statutes methods designed to avoid the silence that protected Bumpy Johnson. Harlem became a quiet reference point inside law enforcement, a reminder that surveillance alone is never enough when authority cannot translate into proof. In the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't win a courtroom battle. He didn't defeat the FBI in public. He simply outlasted them. And in that endurance lies the deeper meaning of this story. Power does not always belong to those who can watch the most, record the most, or control the most technology. Sometimes, it belongs to the one who understands where the system must stop. This was the moment the state learned its limits. And it learned them by watching one man say almost nothing at all.